How you doing today, RJ?
Doing great. Thanks for having me here, Mo.
You're welcome, and it's great to have you on the show. I've been really enjoying your book here, Unlocking the Dream Vision: The Secret History of Creation. And you sent this to me about 2 weeks ago, and I've been consuming it on the side and really enjoying it. And I think it's important as we, get into the story that we learn a little bit about the kind of the history of this. So let's, I guess, start out with the basics. Let's have you explain, as it relates to you, what is the difference between the esoteric and the exoteric for our listeners?
Well, the esoteric is always for the initiated. The exoteric is for the general public, the average person, for doctrines and rhetoric that will be pretty much understood by everybody. The esoteric involves pretty much just initiation of secret knowledge, of doctrine, and of belief. The most common group that's known by most people are the Masons. That is probably the most predominant esoteric group that's around.
Gotcha. So, I grew up in the, Roman Catholic religion, going to church and going through my baptism and so forth, and through the holy rites. And, growing up and going through this and, being raised by my parents who were Roman Catholic from Montreal, Quebec, and so forth, I never really understood what I was going through, and the rites and so forth. So it was kind of really confusing to me as a child, going through this process of this religion that everybody's supposed to understand, but it seemed like no one did, because no one was explaining it to me how I would understand it, maybe in this world, I don't know. But as I got older and learned about this other side of it, the Freemasonic side, I learned a new angle, and it was the philosophies behind the religious teaching. So what was interesting to me is, this thing that's demonized is actually what I learned the most from, and what is, exercised on the outside that so many people practice and don't understand. I never could learn anything. And when I talk to people today, they don't seem to even understand it. So it's interesting. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's basically true. The main reason is like the Catholic Church, which I too was raised Roman Catholic, and I'm very familiar with all the rites. And I too, but uniquely, my family is also Masonic on both sides going back centuries. So I kind of got a unique kind of upbringing. It was always there in the background, but it was never really discussed. And it wasn't like you until I was much older, because the Catholic, the stories seemed fantastical, the miracles, they just didn't make sense, especially to a teenage boy in the 80s. I was just like, this stuff's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. We walk on the moon. How does somebody walk on water? And luckily, through my grandparents, I started getting interested in the esoteric, the Freemasonry, and that part of the family. And that's kind of when I stumbled upon the symbolism and started wondering what that was. And that's kind of where the secret lies between the esoteric and the exoteric. The exoteric of the church, the rites, the baptisms, all of that, that is essentially exoteric. It's easy for everybody to understand. The symbolism and the other stories hidden within the text and those rites is the esoteric part. And that's the part that they kind of keep hidden, but that's where all the answers are, especially today. This isn't 200-300 years ago. We understand technology. We understand mathematics. We aren't scared of lightning anymore and thinking it's the gods banging around. We understand that it's physics and electricity. And that's kind of where my starting point was going into a lot of this, was trying to figure out what was the church talking about, because it didn't make much sense. And what were the Masons and these other groups hiding? Because they all seem to be kind of talking about the same thing. And us poor people are caught in the middle between the two.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. I took it from that angle kind of at first, more of I felt a conspiracy side, even though I feel there is a conspiracy, and we could talk about that a little bit more as we go along. But that, they hid this from me, and how dare they? And, there's this secret cabal, which I believe there is, but again, we'll get into that later, but that was trying to personally keep me down. And then as I got into it, I realized that this information, this knowledge, as far as in this year that we're living, this era, was freely available to us, meaning these books, your book, books going back, you can go on the internet. I was just like I'm just like, my ancestors would have just been, this would have been a dream come true, for their research and their studies. And I was like going, there's like, we live in this world, it's almost like a labyrinth now, and almost like a worldwide initiation, and these symbols that you talk about, especially living here in the United States, we know that it was founded by Freemasons. So Freemasons play a large part in this. And it's interesting that these symbols are found everywhere, and even on our currency. And these are kind of the same symbols that are awakening us, right? And you growing up religious and then having a Masonic family for all those years, I didn't have no idea that I also had involvement as far as my ancestors in Freemasonry and different secret societies, in the Catholic Church especially. So it was really interesting when I started learning this history, and why I was, I felt like I was drawn to it because I had some lineage in there, meaning my ancestors. Do you feel that's true to a lot of us that are maybe drawn to these type of studies, such as yourself?
I think so. I think it has a huge influence. The symbols, the rituals, the rites, they all have an influence. And that's kind of one of the big keys about these symbols and stuff. And is because they influence you, even if you don't quite understand them. That's why they've always been used. And to kind of understand that is where you have to kind of step back before the time of printing and into the age of symbolism that ruled everything, that heraldry, government, religion, everything was controlled by this. And even though most people have forgotten about it, they still influence you exactly the same way. And especially people pick up on them. You see them, like you said, that's on our currency. You see them all the time. And a lot of people don't really wonder what they are, but a lot of people do. And the big key about a lot of this stuff is, you're right, the information really isn't hidden. It's freely available. The key is you have to go and look for it. And that's where this kind of gets into, is it a secret society? Is it a conspiracy? Yes and no. Because the people who do this in these groups, they're looking for intelligent people. They don't want the masses. They only want thinking men, as they normally call it. And the symbols and everything are kind of like a trail of breadcrumbs, and they want you to follow them. And when you follow them, you end up usually standing in front of a Masonic lodge or a similar group, because those symbols lead you right to them because they're the ones using them. And they are kind of used as a recruitment process. They're to tell you a story. And that's kind of where my work comes in, is trying to tell you the story of all these symbols and how they fit together.
Yeah, and let's start out with, I guess, one of the most important players or people who have played a huge part in this story for thousands of years, and that would be the scribes, who you write about in the beginning of your book. So tell us about the scribes and how they have played a part in this grand history.
Well, the scribes are, as most people know, were a professional class of writers that existed in the first civilizations. But most people have a misconception of these individuals. They were, in essence, the first secret society, that, if you want to use that definition, because it's hard for us to remember the time of where only a small group of people could read or write, and they protected that information. It gave them power. And the general history, and I do go into some detail in my book about this, of how through the earliest writing systems, the symbolism starts cropping up. And the main core piece that breaks into the mystical symbolism or esoteric symbolism and the more mundane and profane symbolism or writing occurs when the rich and the powerful could start forcing the scribes to teach them to read and write. So the scribes needed to hide their secret information. And that's pretty much where the symbolism begins. And that's where people forget too that this is ancient. This goes back to the earliest times of our earliest civilizations in the first temples with the first governments, first armies, first everything. And that's a different type of writing because the scribes used a pictographic type of writing where you had little pictures, they would show scenes, but just like today too, we have symbols that were unique to the time. And most people don't understand those symbols when they see them again, because it's just not taught anymore. It's kind of been lost. And that adds to this great confusion. But the scribes themselves built this system of initiation, of education, and all built around hiding their knowledge to keep the words of the gods away from the common man. And it gave them great power. I mean, they were the maker or breakers of kings and could actually influence the priesthoods and stuff. They were actually the little hand behind the scenes running everything in the ancient world.
It's interesting if we look back in history in the ancient world, professions were something that were handed down in families. So I'm assuming, the scribes, they would be, various families, but they would be somehow interconnected through history. And, it seems like you would see this kind of this baton, like they were tasked with this mission, to keep writing about this mystery religion that we'll talk about here. And, they came to some kind of conclusion long ago that, like you'd said, they were going to, hide these secrets. And I'm assuming the elites to them, as far as the wannabe elites would be like, say, the Canaanites, they would be more of the merchants, meaning they weren't bad people, but they were more on about the material world and wealth and the now, where it seems like the scribes were like building possibly God's kingdom. We could talk about Plato and his reference to the Plato's Republic that could be considered somewhat communistic and so forth, and Pythagoras and the different teachings and how these were carried on, and how we now see the Freemasons kind of as the scribes and the philosophers writing about this type of stuff. So what do you feel as far as these scribes being related to one another, and possibly that this has kind of happened, and and then here you are, you're writing a book. I write all the time. I do a lot of research, and this is all fascinating. I sometimes feel like us guys are scribes again, in a different form, blogging about it, right?
Basically true. The scribes were kind of the original bloggers and writers and everything. They controlled all reading, all writing. They decided what was going to be recorded, what was going to be passed on, who was going to be taught. And in most societies, it was father to son. But one of the things that makes the scribes a little unique is over time, they basically opened up to all people of talent. Didn't make any difference if you were male or female or anything. You would go to testing. You would be brought in like today. You take your little 10-year-old kid in and they would run them through a series of tests. And if they showed talent, then they would be recruited. If they didn't, then they would go on. But people who were, if dad was a master scribe, it was just like today. It's pretty much a shoe-in that you were going to be a scribe too. So a very strong tradition, not just through family, but also just through the organization itself developed. And they really went to great lengths to protect their knowledge, just like today. Just like any big company or anything, they want to protect all of their little trade secrets. And you can imagine being the individual that's in control of all the information. You're taking this stuff from the king and you're giving it to the other people and you're deciding. And they can't even really argue with you because they don't even know if your writing is correct because they can't read. So like I said, they had a unique position and they held it for thousands and thousands of years and end up basically turning into Pythagoras and stuff and those types of individuals, because if you go back and look, you'll notice that the vast majority of these men were scribes. That was the only way you could get an education outside of the religious, or unless you were wealthy.
Sure. And you would kind of say that like Pythagoras, would be on along the lines of the science, putting this to science and these theories, and actually, coming out with concrete ideas and philosophies that last to this day and that are built upon by guys that go after him. It seems like those are the people, not every single person that has played a part in it, but these eminent people that have written and then also carry these teachings on, seem to keep passing on this baton. So it's interesting. And we all seem to write about the same people. And I do agree with you, the Catholic Church, I mean, it means universal. And I know the idea back then, as you'd state, was to, work with everybody. It was kind of like, hey, we'll give you the opportunity to work and, learn. And I believe, just like now, you kind of know where you could find this knowledge, but you're still tested, and, you have to find your way. It's just not given to you. And it takes many years of studying, but it's interesting. Let's, talk about the mystery religion that is behind all of this, meaning what were the scribes protecting, and what are the Freemasons also, operating their, the secret societies along with the Freemasons and the various night orders and the royalty that play into that as well. How does this play into, this history, this 2,000, 3,000 year history?
The big key, again, goes back to the scribes and what they're hiding. And what they're hiding is what I write about, the secret history of creation. This paints a much different picture. As you're reading the book, you eventually get into a point where you start realizing that we're not dealing with aliens or gods or anything out of the ordinary, but we're dealing with something that's real, that's something that's technologically based. And a lot of reason it was hidden is because the average person wouldn't accept it. And a kind of an example of that is, if we were to go back 1,000 years and bring a piece of technology with you, say a cell phone or something like that, and you were to show them a little picture, a little video, chances are they would freak out and call you a witch or a warlock and want you burned at the stake because you had this moving magical picture. And that's kind of basically why it was hidden, because of the ignorance of the regular people. And it's only been in the last couple of 100 years that this information, that the average person has actually become educated enough and aware enough that this information is important. It's hiding things like science, like mathematics, philosophy. Most of the things that we base our modern world on actually have their origins way back in this thinking. And we're really lucky that these individuals did hide it and keep these orders and stuff together, because if they hadn't, it would have been lost. The Catholic Church went to great lengths to stomp a lot of this out because they see it as a major competitor to them, where the esoterics, in my opinion, are not really concerned about taking everything over and stuff. They're more, like they say, wanting to kind of lift everybody, educate them, to let them eventually get to the point to understand this knowledge. And they also have to deal with superstition, culture, fear, again, ignorance. And it's only been in the last few generations that you can actually talk about this stuff without the threat to your own life or livelihood. And I think that's where the important thing is. And as more and more people are now starting to learn this and discover it, or writing books and trying to bring it to the public, and to say, hey, stuff isn't crazy. It's really, really important. And we really do need to learn about it.
Yeah, we do. I definitely think so. And only if Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans could only dealt with keyboard warriors, right?
Yeah.
Like we do now. It's just like, it's amazing the world we live in. And if no one knows that story, the alleged death of Pythagoras was said to be happened at the hands of someone who he did not allow into his secret brotherhood. And this guy got extremely angry. And the reason, my understanding would be something you explained. He didn't really have the knowledge and what it takes to go into the society at that time. And what people need to understand, sometimes you're not ready, whether that be, you're just on the road and you think you know it all, maybe you don't, and you need to wait. And sometimes it takes years and decades before that might happen. Or maybe you're a wonder kid and you got your things together and Pythagoras would have invited you in. And then you still have a strict vow of silence for 5 years or whatever it might be, right? Till you learn the way. So
exactly.
Yeah, they ended up basically killing Pythagoras was the story. And when I think about that, I was thinking, well, there was a reason why they started hiding this and took this really seriously. And these guys became kind of warriors as well. They weren't just pushovers with, scribes that could write. They were warriors. I know, they knew how to fight and they knew how warrior skills and so forth, and assassins and the Gnostics play a role in this. And in any event, let's talk about how Enoch, the Masonic legend of Enoch, because this is a big part of your book.
Oh, yes. Enoch is kind of the key. To kind of have to back up before we step into the Masonic legend of Enoch. Enoch is basically, most people have heard of Enoch, but they don't know much about the man. They're familiar that he was in the Old Testament as one of the patriarchs. And outside of that, most people don't know too much more about him. Outside of it, he wrote a book. And the key is the book. The Book of Enoch is probably one of the most controversial books of all time. And as you know, there's a rich history behind it. And the book itself is the key to unlocking not just the symbolism, but also some of the stories and how some of this information is hidden. And the key point in understanding of Enoch is that he was originally trained as a scribe. In the Book of Enoch, he's trained as a scribe. And we were really lucky that the Catholic Church did remove this book 1,400 years ago, because it ended up more or less disappearing in Europe and ending up in Ethiopia. And it sat there for 1,400 years untouched, literally sitting on a shelf collecting dust. And that's what makes the Book of Enoch so important is that compared to all the other religious texts we have, it hasn't been edited. It hasn't been changed. It hasn't had anything done to it. And it provides a real unique window into the past. And starting to get moving up to the Masons is when the Masons and the groups that eventually would become the Masons in the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, the Book of Enoch became very popular. There was kind of like a fad. People started talking about it. There was rumors that it existed here and there, but nobody knew anything about it. They just remembered the ancient stories, and that was one of the reasons. In a minute, we'll get to why it was removed. And the Masons and these early esoteric groups started grasping on and using the Book of Enoch as basically the basis of their organizations. It's unknown if they actually had copies of it or not, but it's pretty clear that they had a bulk of the stories that were contained in it. And these stories and legends started gaining in great popularity. And during the late Renaissance period and the early Enlightenment period, Enoch became immensely popular, primarily because of the ever-famous John Dee and his Enochian keys, the angelic languages, and it exploded. Became possibly the first real big fad. But again, nobody actually had the books. But through the Masons, a whole bunch of stories started popping up around that time. You had stories that Enoch was the one that actually invented writing. You started having stories of where Enoch was the designer of the pyramids, or that he worked with the Greeks, and on and on and on. And it was really kind of amazing, because if it hadn't been for them and the Masons and this popularity, this book probably, we would have never known about Enoch. And the Masons kind of build traditions around it. And all of the legends have basically the same idea. And that was that Enoch was given divine knowledge, that he taught people how to worship the deity in the right way. And he just kind of becomes this mysterious figure that allows you to kind of connect to God in some way that isn't told by the church. And the big change doesn't really happen until Reformation and the Protestants and their great interest in all the books that the Catholic Church had removed. So the Protestants and the early Masons kind of worked together with the same goals, trying to dig up all this old information, trying to organize it. And it also leads to a number of problems, because there's a lot of made up stories. There's a lot of things that just are not true, that have no other basis in history. And it kind of turns into this big confusing mess that kind of goes on for a couple of centuries until the book is actually found again in 1776.
Yeah, and that it's interesting. The scribes, if we look at what they were trying to do back then, is they were trying to avoid kind of the confusing mess. And that's where we could say they got somewhat communistic with their knowledge, and tried to preserve it and kept it from certain people. Because I'll see that now, because, when I first started my path, researching this type of knowledge, I would come across people that, would purport that they had this knowledge, and they would, try to teach you, blog or write a book. And a lot of it led me down the wrong path, so I could see, like, we live in a world where that confusing mess that they had experienced is, a trillion-fold on the internet, right?
Oh, it is. It's incredibly amplified, especially nowadays.
Yeah, and it is, and it seems like that there's also ways to codify and to go through this research, like yourself and myself. And what I learned is you go through the most eminent people, and you go to ancient history, and you read Pythagoras, and you read Plato, and you read all of the true philosophers that they held in high esteem, and you start really getting it after you study this material for you, because it takes years to kind of go through everything, in my opinion. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah, I agree. That's kind of one of the big problems with this, is people tend to forget that the Bible, the scribes, religious texts, the philosophies, these things were not originally written for the average person. They were written for other experts by experts, and compiled and actually written by scribes. So and that kind of gets into a little bit of the history and stuff of why the Catholic Church tried so hard to keep the Bible suppressed and not printed or any copies and stuff, is because they basically knew that the average person wasn't trained in any of this stuff. And that, you're right, it takes years of reading, of studying, it's just like any other education. Just like if you want to become an engineer or you want to become a doctor or something, you have this huge amount of information that you have to learn before you can do anything else. And a lot of it too is, the more advanced stuff doesn't really make sense if you've never been trained in it. And that helps add to the great confusion that behind all of this, is because the average person is not an expert in some of these things. And the only way you become an expert, again, is by reading. You have to go back. You have to read the philosophers. You have to read Enoch. You have to read these obscure books, and to gain all these little tidbits of knowledge.
Yeah. And, a lot of people that don't understand it, they're the first ones sometimes to attack it, and again, that's what we we'll see online, and I've experienced myself. And I could say that, I might have been guilty of it, or I am guilty of it, doing it in the past. So I could see exactly why they would want to do that. And there's this initiation process that one must go through in a degree process. And there's still different players out there kind of confusing you, in my opinion, on purpose, and it's necessary. But it's sometimes kind of fun to see how they do it, because we live in a world, where it's, it is black and white. There is evil, but there is good, and you could find either one, and you could either go through either path. But this, to me, it's really the divine knowledge of, being a divine human and understanding who you are and the philosophies. And that's what really these guys were trying to figure out. And Enoch, he would be one of the most esteemed because he was kind of self-initiated, meaning he taught himself. Is that why he was so huge? Or
no? Enoch's a very unique character. He is very unique in the biblical tradition and the religious tradition in general. One of the primary reasons the book of Enoch was removed was Enoch had a personal one-on-one relationship with God. He literally stood in front of God, looked upon God, and talked to him like we are talking. And that's how it's described in the book of Enoch. Nobody else gets that honor. Moses doesn't get that honor. Jesus doesn't get that honor. He is the only one. And additionally, he is the only one in the tradition that is personally taken by God. He's not taken by one of the angels. He's not taken by a whirlwind. God personally comes and takes him. Again, it makes him totally unique in the entire religious tradition of Judeo-Christian tradition. And the big question is, why? What made Enoch so special that he would get the personal touch from the Almighty himself? And that's kind of one of the reasons why Enoch is mysterious, and also why he holds such a high esteem, especially in esoterics, because he was supposedly, and again in the stories, he is taught directly by the angels how to be a scribe. He's shown all the secrets of heaven, and that he is kind of the template for the ultimate philosopher, person of science who knows not just the physical world, but also the spiritual world. And that's kind of where he becomes really important at. And also that there's been so much mystery surrounding him for so long, just is added to this aura of Enoch. So he really occupies this really unique point in all of the traditions. And he's one of the places where everything kind of crosses over. And that's where, again, as you get farther into the book and stuff and going through the dream vision, you start seeing how he in this story starts connecting between different cultures and different traditions and stuff that you normally don't think are connected together.
Yeah. And when I look at, the alternative history to that, I see there's a history of the Phoenicians, and you'll hear of the story of Cadamus, and he brought letters into Greece, and he was a Phoenician prince, and these philosophers had talked about him, and that the Greeks actually held him in high esteem, almost as if, he was the forefather to kind of the Greek kingdom that kind of passed the knowledge from Egypt. And there's this relationship again with Egypt in this story. Egypt, there's Greece, there's Crete, there's the Phoenicians. Do you see any relation there with Cadamus and the Phoenicians in this story at all? Or?
I didn't really go into any detail into that, but they are ultimately all connected through the traditions. And that is a possible way to help kind of trace how the scribes and everything moved of these stories of, this individual introduced the writings and the teachings to this group of people and stuff. Where it's really more important is that those are just kind of showing the connections. Where you can actually see how they connect together is when you get back into the symbolism, because it's the symbolism, the mystical symbolism, that ends up connecting these traditions, these stories together. And you start realizing, one of the ways I like to describe it is that we have a big, huge book of creation, and it was all torn up. All the chapters were torn up, and everybody has a different chapter of the same book. And nobody quite realizes that they're all talking about the same thing. They think the Phoenicians are separate from the Egyptians are separate from the Persians, and the Persians are different from the other cultures around them. And that, no, they really actually are tied together. There is a continuity through it all. And that's one of the things that the difference between the esoteric and the esoteric is, that this continuity is one of the things that's missing for the average person, because it's hidden within the symbolisms of the story. So you don't see the connections.
Correct. And I agree with you, and I've studied the various different connections. It's somewhat important to me. I mean, really important to me, because I did a test a long time ago, a DNA test, just to try to find out who possibly my ancestors were. And it went into the Phoenicians and the Greek Hellenes. And, when I started studying that history, the kind of the Phoenician kingdom somewhat preceded the Greek Hellene kingdom, so it's kind of understanding how they would honor as well. Like if, they're like almost like they were all cousins, on the same tree, right? And then the branches are going out, and they start realizing like, hey, whoa, you've got similar teachings, and, realizing that these started going around the world. And I think that's important, because a lot of us might be in our country, we're here in the United States, and someone might be in the UK or in Canada or, in Russia or in Mexico. And those are really our nations, not really where we all come from. We all seem to come from many different countries. It's fascinating when you study that history, especially us in the United States. We all immigrated from somewhere.
Yeah. And that's kind of the key. And that's kind of where one of the unique things about the symbolism and stuff, I guess you could say you're kind of looking at a symbolic DNA through the society, because you're trying to find all the little pieces that tie back together. And that, again, comes back to the scribes and stuff, that you have to understand that eventually, in the ancient world, this kind of becomes a standardized system, just like today we're doing, the signs or stop signs and stuff. They're pretty much recognizable in all countries now. I mean, if you go to the UK, you know what a stop sign looks like without even having to know any of the language or anything. And the scribes kind of did this in the ancient world. And I think that's where people have a little misconception, is the ancient world was a lot more advanced and a lot more like us than we give credit to. I mean, they didn't have the electricity and things like many of the conveniences. But if you went back to ancient Rome, you would find all kinds of merchants. If you had money, you could pretty much buy anything you wanted, and it would be high quality. It could be rare, just like today. It would be exotic. And that they were a lot more sophisticated than we like to give them credit for.
I agree. And I mean, if we look at a lot of what we have today, it's the result of what they had helped create and what they had helped build. And that's why I think it's important that we honor that. And you see that, of course, in the lineage of the scribes and the secret societies and the various religions, is, they do honor the very people that dedicate to building this world. And, it's just really a fascinating story. And again, the Freemasons play a large role. And if we go back in history, one of the largest roles in the beginning of this story is the Roman College of Artificers, right?
Yes.
And so I found it fascinating. I want to pull up this research real quick here, because it literally, I read this too. So you say, you talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire, and let me see here. Yeah, you talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire when the Roman College Artificers began retreating to the city of Como in northern Italy, and how they became known as the Comacine Masters. I assume that's how you pronounce it?
Yes, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah, so it's just so weird, because I had a question on my blog this morning, and it related to an article that I had written about these guys and Pliny the Elder, and him being from that area, so I said that he was of Greek or possibly Cretan descent or Phoenician, and that they lived in that area. And so the commenter kind of challenged me on that. He was saying he was Roman, this and that. And my understanding of Rome was that the Romans had many different cultures in their empires, right?
Yeah, and the Greeks were famous. The Romans were famous for hiring Greeks. So
Sure.
it was very common to be in Rome or any Roman province or something, and you would see Greeks. The Greeks held most positions of teaching, philosophies, and things like that. It's kind of like today, if you wanted, you call the IT guy if you need something tech-wise, and that's how the Greeks were. If you wanted to be your kids educated, you got the Greeks. You hired a Greek to come and do it. So it's not unusual that the Greeks were involved or there, and that the Romans were a multinational empire. And if you had citizenship, you were eligible.
Yeah, and when I looked at some of the first emperors in Rome, they were of Cretan descent. So they were from actually the island of Crete, and some were of Greek descent and so forth. And then, like I had mentioned, Pliny the Elder was in this area. So what's interesting, just again, I didn't get to that part in your book because I haven't consumed every single word, but one thing I do is, as I'm on the computer, I go to the bathroom, and I was reading your book, and I literally opened it to that part right after I looked at that comment, and I was just like, I've got to talk about this, and then I found out, through your book, I didn't realize, because I haven't even made the connection you made of these Roman College of Artificers that were really important from this area, and how these Freemasons, essentially, these first Freemasons were pretty much well valued and traveled around the world and were hired and became very powerful. Is that true?
Yes, basically, this college is the connection between the ancient world and the medieval age. They're the ones that held all the information. They were the ones that kept the traditions alive, and they survived primarily because they were the master builders. If you needed something built and you were wealthy, these were the guys you called. And they too held a unique position, and why they were able to survive is because during the final days of Rome, they were the engineers. This was the place where all the engineers were sent to learn how to build roads and fortifications and things like that. They're kind of basically Rome's biggest defense contractor and educational contractor. They did, and that's kind of how they survived, and they possessed all this information, and they kind of become, I always find them really fascinating because they kind of seem to be the template of the mystical old wizard looking kind of individual that we all think about in the medieval age, like a Merlin character and everything, because they were kind of by themselves. They were the only men that could read and write and could build and had tools and engineering. They knew all the old histories and rites. So kind of a mystical awe grew around these guys, and they kind of become the stereotypical wizard kind of character. But they are such an important connection, and they're typically overlooked because that's our connection back. In fact, most of the Charlemagne copies and stuff from the ancient world most likely come from this group. They're the ones that are the most likely candidates that actually preserved this information. And then when Charlemagne came into contact with them, he prudently hired them. and that's how we got this information.
Exactly. And I came to the same conclusion many years ago. Actually, I came to the research on Charlemagne and the building of Paris and the courts there and the University of Paris, and how the Freemasons and all these philosophers played a huge part in that. And that's one of the most frustrating things when I look at Freemasonic history, is that a lot of this part of it doesn't seem to be honored like it should, even though it plays a huge part in their history. It's like, Freemasonry started in the 1700s or the 1600s. And I'm like, no, it did not. We have, of course, modern secret societies and brotherhoods that are carrying the torch for these, but they're not even operative, right? They're more speculative. And,
Yeah.
and
And that's kind of the big difference back in the past is they were much more operative, hands-on. Not only did they have this knowledge, but they sold it. They were the guys that built the buildings, the cathedrals, all this beautiful architecture we see in the Middle Ages in Europe and stuff, all is their work.
yeah,
That's kind of, like one of the big mysteries is how was Charlemagne able to build in the Roman Gothic kind of structure? There was nobody around. Well, it's because he hired these guys, and these guys still knew how to do this, and they built them from it. And that's kind of where, too, getting back to the symbolism, the architecture and the symbolism and all this starts connecting together, because everybody forgets that these guys were originally the builders. They were actually the ones out doing the work. It's not until, like you said, the 1600s, 1700s that it become more speculative. They get away from the work. They only concentrate on the ritual and the information, not actually building and cutting stone and creating these beautiful works of art.
yeah. It seems like you still have, of course, the scribes are involved in directing that, though. Meaning that we still see important Freemasons who mainly dedicate their lives to philosophies and writing and kind of sorting this history to kind of do battle with people that don't understand it. Like they're just always trying to, cut through the muck and figure it out. So that seems like it's a full-time job for any scribe these days, right?
It is. And that's where I think there's a lot of misconceptions about Freemasonry too. These guys kind of get a bad rap. Just like any other group, there's good and bad in both. And, they've done good things and bad things. But for most high-ranking Masons and stuff, you're right. It is kind of a full-time job. They spend most of their time reading the classics, reading old books, sitting around discussing these things, trying to figure out this history and to figure out what's been lost, what's been known, how to kind of straighten out this mess. And they do a lot of good work. But nowadays, everybody else can help in, like you, myself, and others, of starting to realize this information is freely available and anybody can go and look at it. You just have to have an open mind to be able to do it.
I agree. You have to have an open mind and it's being unbiased about the information and not looking at it as far as, through a racial lens or a national lens or a current modern lens. You have to really take those lenses off and just, look at it, like you'd said, through an open mind, and you'll start really discovering a lot of great information, and it's books like yours that, help you understand that. It's, again, I was attracted to Charlemagne because my family actually was in that area, and in my opinion, they were involved in the building of University of Paris, and actually up until the 1500s, after I think right about the Reformation, when they destroyed the monasteries, King Henry VIII. That would be when we kind of left the picture. That's why literally we were in Quebec, Montreal, Quebec, in Canada, right shortly thereafter. And then one of my ancestors was exiled because he had fought the king, because he wanted to divorce and marry someone. And they were like, the church was like, no.
Oh.
And yeah. So, and then he just ended up booting everybody out of the monasteries. And I know that was a huge part of Freemasonry, because at that time, my understanding is the monks and so forth were involved with Freemasonry at that time. But I know you don't get into that, so I don't want to go into that history, but it's a real fascinating history. And it's great because I think we all like put it together. Like you had said, we're all kind of building this masterpiece and putting this knowledge together. And it's important, that we all kind of share it. And, you always see this, right? And the conspiracy theorists, immediately think something evil, right?
Exactly.
And I think it's important that people hear the research and knowledge, not just from myself, but people like you that have actually done their research and they understand it. So can you explain that symbol and the history of it?
The all-seeing eye is one of the most interesting symbols, along with the pyramid. It's actually one of the first parts that you start stepping into when you start getting into the dream vision and the symbolism. And I always like to warn people that when you first start hearing some of this stuff, it sounds a little crazy, it might seem a little out there. And it's, again, because of the way the scribes taught, and it's supposed to sound a little crazy. And so the average person goes, oh, no, that's crazy. And I walk away and don't deal with it. It's to spark your interest. The all-seeing eye is traditionally always thought of as being the eye of God, the eye of providence looking down upon mankind. And that's kind of the starting point. As you go through this story, like I said before, you start discovering that you're not dealing with gods and stuff, that you're actually dealing with real physical entities, beings. Not going to give away the story. They're not really aliens, but they are technologically advanced. And that within the ancient world, they had a huge space station essentially in low Earth orbit. And it looked like a giant eyeball looking down on humanity. And like I said, this sounds a little crazy the first time you hear it. But once you kind of understand that and start understanding how it fits into the story, and you'll start seeing the other connections that within our history, there's a lot of folklore and stories of cities floating up above the clouds. We use it today in science fiction. There's, Jack and the Beanstalk stories. There's always something up above the clouds, and it's usually related to the gods. And this is what our ancestors saw. And they saw this on a regular basis. And it's that type of information that's hidden within the symbolism and sounds a little bit crazy. It's also connected into the pyramid shape. And it's kind of hard to explain at the moment because it all connects right back to the fall of the angels or the fallen watchers within the book of Enoch and the corruption of man. And it only kind of adds to the confusion of how these things build together. The main problem is a symbol like the all-seeing eye is really advanced into the story, where you kind of are missing about half of the symbolism in the story that leads up to that symbolism. And it's I'm having a little bit of a brain cramp.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, you see that everywhere, and a lot of people assume that it's evil, and if you look at the various interpretations out there, you have the grand architect of the universe, and when I researched that recently, I'd written about Plato's demiurge, and that seemed to connect to me to this grand architect that was forming this universe that we have here, and it wasn't necessarily aliens per se, like you had said, and it seems like certain people are kind of connected to this this world, and it's through these symbols, I believe, that we're all kind of connected and drawn to it, and there's just a lot of misconceptions and so forth. And I know there's a lot of secrets behind it, and that's kind of our goal, is to figure those things out. But yeah, again, it relates, to my opinion, to the grand architect of the universe, which of course is, one of the gods of Freemasonry, right?
Yes, it's usually considered as the God, the Almighty, the great maker, creator, whatever name you want to go by, depending on your belief system. And that's the main point, is that symbol is not evil. It is a symbol to represent God. And I think that's where people get kind of a little confused, is they start, and a lot of it has to do with the demonization of the church, because even the Catholic Church uses some of these symbols, but they don't tell you why they're using them. And it's because they're related back to this old tradition of the scribes and things like that, and that these symbols really aren't evil. They're not really, spooky or anything like that. That's more or less the church demonizing it.
Sure. And a lot of the people, in my opinion, saying things like this are evil, that don't have the knowledge or understanding of them. And those are the same people back in history that would have, killed Pythagoras, or would have burned you for having a camera or whatever, right? You're a
exactly.
witch. So I get it, why that is done, because, I've been attacked several times by, people that I, felt didn't have knowledge and were ignorant of the things I was talking about. And I actually have family members and people that think I'm, evil because I look at stuff like this and the so-called occult and esoteric matters. And, and I'm trying to purge the sin from my body, and trying to actually live the philosophies that religion, talks about, because it's important. And, there is an unseen world, and there is these things that we can't see with these two eyes. That's really incredible and both frightening, and a lot of people can't understand it, and let alone some of the words and things that we talk about. And I think it is somewhat frightening and scary, what we have to deal with. And if you look at the history of the Bible and the battles that they talk about, the various saints, Job and, Jesus, everybody's battling the devil and these demons and so forth. And I believe they talked different than we talk now, but we're all having those similar battles, but just in a different way. We're not thinking properly, and we're having the same illnesses and the same diseases as a result of the way that we're living, which they called back then sinning. You were a glutton, if you're very overweight, and you were a glutton and you had various ailments, that was because you were sinning, you were eating too much. And, if you're a sloth on top of that, right, you're not moving, you're going to get sores on your ass, all things, and again, I'm guilty of all that stuff, so I feel like I've went through a lot of these sins to understand them, and to also understand, of course, the religious side and then the philosophical side of this. And sometimes people on the religious side, they don't really understand the philosophies of the religious teachings that they are teaching other people, so that's interesting, and what I find interesting, I know we're going to wrap it up here in the next 15 minutes or so. The Black Death, the Black Death is something that I'm writing about in my journey because it affected my family. And what's interesting is you see this popping up time and time again, especially when there seems to be great upheaval and things are happening in the world, or when very mysterious men come onto the scene, whether it be a Francis Bacon or a Nostradamus, Paracelsus, all these different people seem to kind of pop up, and there seems to be a Black Death going on. And to make a long story short, and I've told this story before, but my family was affected by mold in a house we were renting, and my son got sick. And I didn't know about mold at that time, but in any event, it almost took his life, and it made me crazy, and I got sick from it. And we ended up healing from it over time. But as I had studied it, it brought me to the plague and to Black Death. And I really related my story and what I see now, because I own a business where we do mold inspections and mold removal. And I'm going into everybody's house, like, say a Nostradamus or a Paracelsus did in old times. And I'm seeing the mold, and I'm seeing it affect people, and I'm seeing people go crazy and people be sick, and then, as it relates to today in current events, we have the coronavirus, and they're literally locking down whole states in China, 56 million people. And I mean, It seems to be spreading rapidly, the reports. And it's just like, I feel like I'm living in a deja vu, and then I'm reading, again, the Black Death in your book, I'm going, oh no, I'm going to have to ask RJ about this. And, so what are your thoughts? How does this play into the story and history? Can you comment on that?
Well, in the case of the Black Death in this, it was a unique point in history because it was so devastating and radically changed society. Most of the structure that kept most of this information hidden was just ripped away, and allowed people to start thinking, to start questioning. And, you didn't have to worry about being burned at the stake if your local priest had just died from the plague, and they wouldn't come around you. So it had a profound impact. I mean, just not society wise, but for thinking wise, people started questioning everything. And I think that's where it's important for any of these calamities or anything that's happened through history, is because it leads to people questioning the current structure. You know, in the case of the Black Death in the 13th century, people started questioning the church and their control and their interpretation of everything. And people started realizing that what they were telling them and what they were seeing and experiencing were two totally different things. You know, hey, this person lived a good, perfect life. I thought they were awesome, and they got the plague and died. And then this other person, who is the ultimate sinner in the town, he lives with no problem. You know, so people were like, what's going on here? We're not getting the right information. And I think in our modern day, we're quickly reaching that point, technologically wise, society wise, and stuff, where we've kind of hit the limits of the current system, and people are now starting to question it and wanting to know more and to go, are there other possibilities? Is this the way, you know, is this the right way we've been doing things? And it always seems, and I agree with you, that Ma Nature seems to give us a little shove with a disease or anything. And I've often wondered myself if it's connected to our mental states. And, you know, if we pollute our bodies, then we kind of pollute ourselves and our houses. And, you know, and you just kind of become a real horrible person. And you have to, and it takes a lot of effort to get out of that. You know, like you said, to heal yourself, to start eating right, to dealing with your problems, taking responsibility for your actions, and getting back to the scribes and everything. That was pretty much all kind of common sense. And like you said before, us and the ancients talk differently and kind of see things differently, but we have the same problems. So, you know, where somebody said, oh, yeah, well, you're a sinner because you're fat, you're lazy, you don't do anything. That's why you're sick. That's why your house is garbage, blah, blah, blah.
It was true, right?
Yeah, it was something true. And the same thing kind of goes today. And
sure.
That's where people kind of forget that people didn't have the education. They didn't have the personal knowledge. They might have never gotten more than a couple of miles away from their home. And so how do you explain stuff to those people, and how do you shock them out of those cages? And again, it comes back to, I think, Ma Nature just kind of gives us a shove every once in a while.
I do. I agree with you. And I think that's, you know, part of the lessons and the reasons that they taught us about these, you know, and I believe, you know, that, you know, there are a lot of good lessons in these Bible stories and, you know, the Bible and the regular scriptures, and of course the book of Enoch, and then also you have the various philosophies and people like yourself who could write about them, right, and try to make sense of them all for us, you know. And I think it's important, again, that we take this knowledge and we share it freely with one another. And of course, books cost money, right?
Yeah.
You have to, you know, but you know, it's great that people like you, you know, and I've had many other people on the podcast that share their time freely. You know, I don't pay you. You know, I'm not paid really. We make hardly any money to do this. And we're like trying to, you know, build a more beautiful world and cut through the disinformation and so forth. So it's really important. So thank you for the work you're doing. And you know, before we leave, RJ, how do you see maybe this history playing a part in modern events? Are you seeing any parallels? I know you had published this book a little while ago, but I know you're probably thinking about different things. Are you any comments on that?
I think so. I think history always influences us. It's my hope that as more people become aware of this, that they'll see that some of these connections in history exist, and that many of the same things are happening again, sometimes not planned out and other times being planned out because people are not the nicest individuals and take this information and use it against you and for everybody. And that's kind of why I do this. Is I have a problem with this information being hidden. I think everybody has a right to this. They should be able to read it, make up their own minds, and see if it helps them or not, you know, like any other belief system. And that's, you know, I have a little problem with like the Masons and stuff because they do hide it from the public. And I think the public needs this information. I think we're finally, as a species and a civilization, have reached the point where we can handle some of the rougher information and discover that, yeah, some of the things we thought weren't true, but that it also opens up an incredible new world that it's a lot more wonderful, a lot more beautiful, and a lot more mysterious than you can even possibly imagine. And I think that's where we all kind of need to get to eventually, is just kind of understanding all of that.
Yeah, I agree. And there is, you could find if you're looking for evil and darkness, you could find that. And if you're looking for beauty, you could find that, and I believe, in my opinion, that we might be at a precipice, for the age. If you look at the year that we're in the year 2020, and most people don't even question that. They're like, do you know when this age started? Or when this era started? They were like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, we're in the year 2020, and I was like, do you think this might like end? Because like they usually go in like epochs and they'll start over, and I feel like we're almost going to that era, or at least in our modern era. There's going to be a change and a shift, and I'm actually seeing that in Freemasonry, and I'm seeing that with the Illuminati organizations that are out there, and a lot of people don't understand that they do exist, and there are out there, and they're at the top layers, and it's kind of like the pyramid, and you're not going to be ready to go there until you're ready, and you're the more you attack them, the more you look at the world as darkness and evil, and the more you contribute to that, feed that negative energy, the more this information is going to be hidden from you. And it's almost designed to be that way. But I do see a change happening. I hope that we see that happening, in our lifetime, and like what you're doing, you're sharing the information freely. So I'm sharing it. There's other people out there, and I know there's some other Freemasons that are doing that, and various Illuminati organizations that are actually, they seem to be changing and morphing from the old, where they were hiding everything and opening it up. I'm seeing that happen as well. So it's interesting where the rabbit hole leads you. And thank you for your time, RJ. And where could people find your great book here again, Unlocking the Dream Vision, The Secret History of Creation? Where can they find this book? It's
currently available worldwide on Amazon for paperback, ebook, and it is free if you have Amazon Unlimited.
Okay, great. And do you have a website?
Right now, I just have a blog, which hasn't had much work on it right now because I'm working on another book. It's The Watcher of the Eye. And just have to put that in Google and it'll show right up. And awesome. I am on Facebook and other social medias.
Great. When do you plan on coming out with your new book?
I hope to be done with the manuscript in just the next month or so. And then it takes about 6 months of editing and all the processes to finally get it all compiled together into a book form. So I'm hoping by the end of summer, it'll be available on the market.
Good. Good luck with your new book. And again, thank you for your time coming on the Gnostic Warrior, RJ. And let's talk again when your new book comes out, and I'll have you on the podcast.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed being here.
You're welcome. Take care. Thank you.
You too.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, RJ. It went well.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. And what I'll do, I think this is going to be, I don't even think I got to edit much. You did have a little...
one brain cramp.
Yeah, but still, I mean, I do that all the time, so I'll try to, I don't think I even need to edit that out because we're all human, and it wasn't that long, and I kind of picked it up, Yeah. I didn't leave you sitting for 15 seconds, I do that sometimes, like literally I'll be like, and a lot of the time I'll have a question in my head, and then someone will be talking, of course, my interviewee and so forth, and I have a question in my head, but he goes a different way. And then I'll be like, where did I go? And because, it's hard, and sometimes like you'll write a book, like you do. And sometimes you'll be writing a new book and you forget some little pieces, right? Because
pretty much. Yeah. Because the second book is picking up eventually when you get into it. There's a point in the Dream Vision that talks of the twin brothers.
Sure.
And that's kind of where the next book's picking up, is going down that little avenue.
Yeah.
And you kind of get confused as I'm sitting there going, well, wait a second, what am I talking about? Because things change.
They do. And sometimes your philosophy or the way you look at things might change a little bit, So I totally get that because, I could write about something 2 months ago on my blog and I'm researching a different subject and I forgot, a lot of details of what I'd written about 2 months ago. And people ask me like, I got to look at it
hold on a second.
Yeah. But once you look at it, it's literally like, oh, I got it. Right.
Yeah. Okay. I remember that.
Yeah. So, all right, cool. Thank you, RJ. Let's keep in touch.
Okay. Thanks for having me on your show, man.
Okay. You're welcome. Take care.
You too.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.